Hello and welcome to Abnormal Euphoria. Today we're going to start with nicotine and benzoic acid and turn it into nicotine salt. That's nicotine benzoate. And in the meantime, during that, we're going to talk about what it takes to make the perfect vape. Please bear with us. It's our first video. We're going to get the streaming stuff figured out. But in any event, let's get on to the video. We are a lab and production facility for various flavors, synthetic nicotine and salts. I also spend a lot of my personal time just analyzing and reverse engineering as many things as I can to determine how they all work. We have several labs like this with fume hoods. We have several analytical instruments. We have half a dozen mass spectrometers to identify molecules. We have HPLCs to purify, concentrate, and or even analyze them. We have atomic absorption spectrometers to determine metals in things. We have atomic emission detectors, FIDs, and all kinds of other instruments that help us identify every single molecule and compound we can in just about anything through a series of extractions or just neat injections. In any event, that's about that. Myself, I've been working with this sort of analytical instrument, vaping type technology for the last 10 years. We focused a lot on synthetic nicotine since 16. We perfected it in 18, and it's been scaled up to full-scale production. But what's critical here, and what I really wanted to cover in these series of videos, was a lot of do-it-yourself stuff. How do you make nicotine salts? How do you do it safely? How do you work with this stuff? How should it really be to make that perfect vape? So without any further ado, I'm going to move right into how you make nicotine benzoate, which is one of the most popular common salts. It's by no means the end-all be-all salt. There are many others that are needed with it to create the satisfaction and the feel and the hit that you're looking for. But in any event, we'll start here. We set up for all of our videos. We set up fume hood cams and the central cams. In our production side, when we go over there, you'll be seeing large glass reactors, anything up to from a few milliliters up to 250 gallons. So we'll be covering production and things all the way through. But starting with this, we'll start with how do you make your first nicotine salt? I'm going to cover it from a do-it-yourself perspective, and then how we would do it in the lab, and then how you do it in production. From a do-it-yourself perspective, I recommend doing it in a carrier. One, it allows you to dilute the nicotine, and that's important because pure nicotine is very dangerous. It's extremely toxic. It has a very, very low lethal dose. 100 milligrams or so will put you down. So you've got to be careful. You should be wearing the right stuff. You ideally should have a fume hood like this, and you should have the proper gloves and protective PPE to ensure that you don't get splashed. One drop of it will get absorbed very quickly and will cause you serious harm or death. So without further ado, what I'm doing is I have set up a solution here of 100 milliliters of vegetable glycerin, which just so happens that the benzoic acid and the nicotine are soluble in. So it means we can make our salt in a safer medium. I've preheated this vegetable glycerin to 66 degrees Celsius, as you can see in the fume hood. Lastly, I've pre-weighed some pure nicotine. Pure nicotine is water white, has the consistency of kind of like water, but a little oily, and again, very, very dangerous. As usual with chemical reactions, some of these are endothermic and some of them are exothermic. What that means is some of these reactions need heat to occur, so they need energy in order to bond. Others release energy, so we may have to cool them. So some of these salts you'll see that we'll make will actually have to be chilled or cooled so that they don't go out of control and nicotine just doesn't boil off. In this case here, we're dealing with a somewhat of a reaction that really doesn't matter, so we can just preheat it to speed the reaction up. I always suggest that you dissolve the acid first in whatever you're using. So in this case here, we're using vegetable glycerin. I'll put on my gloves and we'll go to the fume hood cam while I work with all these things. Okay, so here we are under the fume hood. So what we have here in our lab is we have a pH meter here. We have a thermocouple to determine the temperature inside the beaker to ensure we're okay. I've made my nicotine over here. I already used my mortar and pestle here to grind up the benzoic acid into a fine powder into this here. I'm going to add the benzoic acid directly to the vegetable glycerin. Carefully. It's on a stir bar so that it will help dissolve it sooner and quicker. If you're the kind of person like myself that wants instant gratification, you don't have to wait till it totally dissolves. You can add your nicotine at any time. What is important in some of these reactions is that the reaction could get very hot, so it's exothermic, so you would add the nicotine very slowly. In this case here, generally don't find that to be a problem, so we can add the nicotine rather quickly, but I still always recommend drip-wise additions. So once this gets dissolved to a certain point here, I'll turn the stir bar up if I can a bit, speed up a bit more. When some of it starts dissolving, I will add the nicotine. Again, make sure when adding pure nicotine that you have butyl gloves or some other kind of gloves that that are very chemically resistant to just about everything. You don't want any of this nicotine to splash, splatter, or drop on your hands, body, arms, anything in any way. So it's very, very important that you treat this stuff with a lot of respect. And then while this is mixing, you will watch it actually change reaction. So here's our nicotine, and I'm going to use a pipette to put the nicotine in slowly. This is what you should do. You'll notice that's very, very clear. Put this in. But be mindful of anywhere the nicotine could drop or drip is a very toxic place, and then you will want to clean it up very, very, very carefully. Notice that I'm just dropping it in drip-wise, and this is just in case you run into a situation where the reaction takes off on you and gets very, very hot. You don't want that to occur. I'm watching the temperature here, and it's 65.2 Celsius. It's really not heating up all that much, so I'm in pretty good shape. Now, fortunately, a lot of the nicotine salts change colors, so you'll know when you've created the salt. In this case here, nicotine benzoate is orange. Anytime I'm finished with anything like this, I put it off into a glass dish where I can then later take care of this and clean it up carefully. I also place my gloves in a sink or container where it can be cleaned and washed. Now, while this is running, and you can watch it on the cam, I'm actually going to flip the cameras back so that I can talk about making the perfect vape while this is happening. Okay, so the nicotine and benzoic acid have been added. So let's talk about how much and how you arrive at that. You just don't add random amounts of nicotine and benzoic acid. There's a very specific formula for nicotine salts. In this case, benzoic acid and nicotine are added in 1-to-1 molar ratios. That means 122 grams of benzoic acid, its molar mass, with 162 grams of nicotine. In this case here, because I was making 100 milliliters of vegetable glycerin, and I wanted to have basically 100 milligrams per milliliter, you would then add 10 grams of pure nicotine and 7.52 grams of benzoic acid. Those two are added together in here, and you'll watch them react over time. And at the end of this video, this should turn from its clear white, it looks like it's already starting to turn a little bit yellow, it should turn bright orange. So going on to the most important thing, what makes the perfect vape? Well, fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, Big Tobacco did a lot of that work for us. They spent 50 years and billions of dollars looking at tobacco from every single aspect. How to manipulate the nicotine. What kind of nicotine salts are in there? What kind of carriers, humectants can they add to it? What kind of prodrugs, additives, enhancers, just about everything you could think of to make that experience more desirable, to make it more satisfying. And by doing so, we can reverse engineer or look at some of the cigarettes over time to see how their technology evolved and how this could potentially be applied to vaping in a less harmful way. Because working with real tobacco has some substantial amount of carcinogens in it, including some of the additives, as I found. In our case, what we've done is we've taken the top-selling cigarettes and applied them to thousands of analysis through mass specs, HPLCs, to determine what exactly all of the manipulation of all the chemistry in the plant is that got them to the perfect smoke. Now, I realize in the vaping world they don't like tobacco and smoking, but that technology directly applies to vaping when you're looking at the final part of the smoking, where you've got a burning end and you're drawing through. And while you're drawing through, the rest of that cigarette is actually acting as a vape because you have hot air passing through tobacco, passing through the flavors they add. It's things called the aftercut, their casings, all these things on the different tobaccos that create that feel and effect. So what's different from tobacco and vaping is that tobacco is about the pyrolysis and the burning product with some boiling, some heating. Vaping is all about heating and not burning. So we're going to use the technology from the smoking side to apply to the vaping side. And most importantly, with synthetic nicotine now, we can do it without using any tobacco at all. So in making the perfect vape, there's things to look at. Right now, vaping industry, from our analysis, and we've analyzed some of the top selling brands in the US, are about 50 years behind big tobacco. That means if you looked at a cigarette from 1970 or 1965, that's about where your vaping juices and products are today. So they got a long ways to catch up. They aren't using particularly, let's say, the right optimal carriers that are the safest, the right flavors that cause not only a good flavor, but a good feeling. And what I'm finding in a lot of these flavors is they don't have these other enhancers that make that nicotine feel so much better or the throat hit just perfect. Another thing that's missing is the salts. Nicotine salts in vaping were just out a few years ago. Well, in tobacco, they've been around since day one. They've been manipulated since the 60s. They were perfected in the 80s, and they were mind-blowing in 2000 forward. So when you're looking at a nicotine salt like we produced here, this is one salt. A nicotine plant has over 100. Sorry, tobacco plant has over 100 salts. And what's so important is, much like flavors, nicotine salts have to be in specific ratios to create certain physiological effects, feel, and just satisfaction. Putting a couple of them in a vape helps, but the difference between a vape that has, let's say, 30 nicotine salts in the right ratios is nothing in comparison to a nicotine and to a vaping product that has a couple of salts and just brute forcing it with like 40 milligrams of nicotine. In actual fact, in a lot of mature flavors that you taste when you eat your favorite chocolate or your favorite foods, a lot of these companies have figured out what fine minor compounds they can add that really enhance the feeling of the product. And that has to be done on the vaping side too. It really changes the way you enjoy it. And in all fairness, it would be like going back to a product before there were nicotine salts or before there were more mature flavors. So in order to make the perfect vape, there are several things that have to be done. One, the right carriers. That means VG, PG, PDO, and others. The right flavors. Most flavors now, when we analyze them, there may be 22 to 25 ingredients. Not all of them are even FDA approved. A lot of folks are using, what we're finding, looks like flavors that are used for drinks, they're using in vaping, which is not a good idea, because just because something's good for drinking doesn't mean you can breathe it in, much like vitamin E problem. You have to have the right nicotine salts. Adding this nicotine salt and a couple others, like nicotine malate or such, isn't going to make the product any better. You need a whole series of salts, even down to a few parts per million in some, will make a big difference between liking one or liking one better. I've pulled out a few acids of the kind of salts. You have the benzoic acid to make nicotine benzoate. You have sorbic acid to make nicotine sorbate. You have citric acid to make nicotine citrate. You can go on and on and on. A lot of them that aren't being used, like malic acid to make nicotine malate. And then we can go on through a lot of the things that haven't even happened yet in vaping. For example, all of the fatty acids that you would find in oils, like caprylic acid, linoleic acid, oleic acid. All of those are in the tobacco plant. And they're used and they make nicotine salts. And this is a prime example of salts that aren't even in modern day vaping now. And they should be, and they will be now. And then finally we have hexanoic acid, which is used in many products we found across the board, not only in vaping. And all of these acids appear in natural compounds. They appear in natural plants. And they are part of the nicotine product in the end. So all the nicotine salts combine with these acids to create very unique ratios of nicotine salts. The last thing that's needed to be added that isn't part of the natural plant is where a lot of big companies have gone in and said, what can I add to make the experience better? How can I make the nicotine pass the blood-brain barrier faster? And that's where you get into the enhancers and the prodrugs. And we'll be covering those in another series of our YouTube videos where we actually cover what you put in, how much, and what they did. So it's really, what did big tobacco do and what was the effect? Well, the effect was 30-40% market share versus no sales or low sales for low-end smokes. So when you get all of these factors put in together, which is the right carrier, the right flavor, the right nicotine salts, in all the right ratios with the proper enhancers and prodrugs, you've created, at that point, the perfect vape. Where when you hit it, you feel great, it's good, it's all happy. So now that we've talked about what we're going to do over several series, you're not only going to see this fume hood, we're going to be in front of mass specs where you'll see the instruments actually operate and run, and you'll watch the compounds come over, and I'll explain what that is and how it works, and how we reverse engineer things, and more importantly, how you make them better. And then lastly is really how we take all of this and then do it at production scale. For example, when making nicotine salts for a do-it-yourself, this might be good enough. This will eventually turn orange. But there's free nicotine in there and free acid. Those two will impact the feel, the aroma, and the effect. Can't have that. So in a lab, we would make this with the pH meter on here, be monitoring it, and I'd get it as close as I possibly could, where I'd have as little free nicotine and free benzoic acid as possible. At that point in time, we would then add some sort of binary solvent that would separate the salt we want, which will be a nice thick goo, or in a lot of cases it's actually a crystal, versus all of the free compounds, the leftover compounds, kind of like the excess stuff when you're baking a recipe. We're going to have excess nicotine in there that didn't react, or excess benzoic acid. It's those two we want out. So then all we're left with is a pure nicotine salt. When you make all of these salts, and we go through and we wash it and we do all these purifications, we can then take them all and put them individually into a new carrier to make the perfect ratio. So there might only be 10% benzoic acid, 20% of the nicotine malate, maybe 5% nicotine purate or butyric acid or butyric, nicotine butyric. There'll be all kinds at all these different ratios, which are so critical to be balanced to give the full effect that should be there. Essentially, so that is what we're going to be doing, and over the next few videos we'll be covering how to make other salts, because not all salts are like this one. You don't necessarily do a molar 1-to-1 mix. Some are 2-to-1, 3-to-1, depending on the acid used. Some of them have to be heated, some of them, as I said, have to be chilled. So there's a whole bunch of different things that have to be done to make each one. And what's important at the end of the day is you try and store, from a do-it-yourself perspective, your nicotine salt in a diluted form so that it is as safely as you can possibly make it. So if your final vape is going to be 6 milligrams, then maybe dilute it down to 10 milligrams so that at least you've got something that's stored that's relatively safe. It should be kept away from children. It should be in a sealed container. Generally in the lab, we would use nitrogen. So we have a nitrogen line here that we would normally add over onto a reactor making this. And by heating something and putting it in nitrogen, we're not oxidizing it. So, when nicotine sits around for a while, it turns brown. Here, it would stay water white or a perfect orange. So the whole job in the lab or the production side of things is to keep the products, the final product, from decomposing, oxidizing, hydrolysis. We don't want any water getting into it. We want to keep it dry, pure, and neat, ready for the next addition into a product. So with that, that's where it is, and I'll come back to you in a few. We'll come back in a few minutes when this is getting closer to completion. After 45 minutes, here's what you've got: a nice orange nicotine benzoate. Over the next few series, we'll be covering other nicotine salts. Some of them will have other colors. Some of them will even come out as nice, cool crystal structures. In the event, in the end, you're going to take all of these, blend them together to make the first part in your perfect vape. Make sure, you see it's still warm, make sure you let this cool off and seal it so that air can't get at it, so it doesn't decompose. Nicotine salts are generally quite stable, but in any event, they should be sealed in a container and away from any pets or young children. This is our first in the series. Look forward to seeing you again in a couple of days when we cover the next nicotine salt and what it takes to make the perfect vape. What you're looking at here is one part of our asymmetric nicotine synthesis process.